Content warning. The content of this podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or psychological advice. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any professional organizations. If you or someone you know is experiencing mental health issues or a crisis, please seek help from a qualified mental health professional or contact a crisis support service by dialing 988. Always consult with the licensed therapist or counselor for personalized support and guidance. Welcome to Queer in Here, Let's Talk Mental Health, and I'm Alicia Nolan. My pronouns are she, her, 3-time Amazon bestselling author and owner of Choose to Live. This podcast is dedicated to LGBTQ+ mental wellness. A diverse selection of mental health professionals and passionate storytellers will come together to create a safe and supportive space for everyone. Each episode features insightful conversations that explore the unique challenges faced by the LGBTQ+ community, weaving in personal narratives that resonate deeply with experiences of identity, acceptance, and resilience. This podcast will not only provide valuable tools for coping and healing, but it will also foster a sense of belonging, reminding followers that they are not alone in their journeys, and intends to inspire hope, spark dialogue, and promote mental wellness for everyone. Hello and welcome. I have Ron with me here today. Thank you for being here. And would you mind just go ahead and starting us off with a little introduction for the audience?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ron Padron, or Reverend Ron Padron, which is kind of the hat I'm wearing in this space. But I am a queer, disabled, Cuban-American. I was born in Florida. I was raised in the South. I currently live in the Mid-Atlantic. And I am the founder is not the right word because it's not a tradition or a path, but creator of White Rose Witching, which is the vehicle or sort of the house that I use for a lot of the work that I do for my advocacy and activism, LGBTQ+ and disability specifically. But the big focus of it and sort of like the ministry work that I do, I'm an ordained pagan cleric, is around queer affirming and queer centered spirituality, specifically in pagan contexts, but also in a larger interfaith sort of approach as well.
Okay, fantastic. I love what you're doing for the community. Like we
Thanks.
need some, especially when it comes to like disability and work, like that is huge. Okay, let's start, which is for me personally, I love hearing about backgrounds in the journey that led people into the work that they're doing, because a lot of passion gets derived from that. So yeah, let's start off with your journey, if you don't mind walking us through that.
Sure. Yeah. So I mentioned being Cuban American. I was born in Miami. I was raised for the first part of my life in Miami before my parents moved us out to the swamp to kind of get out of the city. And then that was a whole different phase. But growing up, my mom is from Cuba. My dad was born in Miami, but his dad was Hispanic. So kind of grew up in that culture, grew up very close with my mom's side of the family. And so I was raised Roman Catholic. I was raised Roman Catholic in that sort of married now. And my husband is from the Mid-Atlantic. His family background is like Irish and English and also Roman Catholic, but Irish Catholic and like Cuban or Caribbean Catholicism is very different. We learned that when we got to that part of the relationship where we talked about like religious upbringing. But so I was raised in that milieu, and the church that we went to was actually in an old community center. So it wasn't like this big cathedral or big sort of edifice. They eventually built one. We moved when I was in middle school. And the last year we were there, they finally had that church. But I grew up very involved in the church. But because it was in this like converted community center, it was much more about the people. And the priest in our parish was actually somebody that my dad had gone to high school with. And so I grew up in this very sort of community-centered space. My mom didn't stop working when I was born. I have a younger brother. When he was born, then she became a full-time, stay-at-home mom. And so during the day, my grandmother and great-grandmother would watch me. I, would stay with them. My great-grandmother didn't speak any English. And so I would, putz around with her. She would take me to like the bodega to like the groceries for the day so she could cook. So I was always in these different spaces that were really, really communal or community based. And I was very much involved with the church when I was little. I was an altar server. My dad had been an altar server. And so then, it was an expectation, I guess, that I would be one. But I really enjoyed it. And when I was little, in elementary school, when people would ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, actually, I told people I wanted to be a priest. And so long story short, I ended up doing that, but in a completely different way, a completely unexpected way. And when we moved out of Miami, so all to say that foundation is something where sort of religiosity or spirituality or some sort of connection to something that's larger than just sort of like ourselves or the world that we see or the world that we understand was really important to me and really ingrained in me and something that I really kind of gravitated to as a kid. And then when we moved out of Miami, we moved to the swamp. We moved out of I tell people that my race consciousness didn't really kind of emerge until I was in like middle school or high school, because where I grew up in Miami, even in my own family, I have people of all different sorts of like levels of melanin, but I was much more likely to know like who was Cuban or who was Puerto Rican or who was Dominican. Like that was the more salient thing growing up. When we moved out of that area into the swamp, it was a very, very homogenous, very white community. And so it was sort of, my parents even for a time changed how they pronounced our last name to sound like more American, more Americanized. So that was a shock. And then we started going to this new church that was almost entirely white. I'm trying to think if there's anybody who wasn't white in that church. And it was what I would today call sort of like proto-MAGA or pre-MAGA. Like it was a very conservative,
cult-like.
Yeah, but it was that thing where it's just like for an hour a week, everybody was like pretending to be Catholic. And then as soon as it was done, everybody was like rushing to get out of the parking lot and cutting each other off and like flicking each other off, like that sort of stuff. So
that's right.
Yeah. So, and that was also the time, kind of in late middle school, when I started to realize that I was gay. I didn't have so I just turned 40. I didn't have the language for it. The media wasn't there. This was pre-internet. Mm-hmm. So, and we were like the third house on our block. Like my parents had, like, we built our house and we moved out to the swamp. So like it was very remote, dirt roads, like no lights, like that sort of stuff. So there weren't a ton of other kids to hang out around. And so I didn't have the media didn't exist. I didn't have the access to like socialization to kind of develop the awareness or the knowledge of it. My uncle, who's only about 10 or 12 years older than me, he's gay, but nobody talked about it. He was spending his time between South Beach and New York. So like I didn't really have that, but I was in that moment where I was like, this church feels different than the church that I grew up in. I'm also starting to realize some stuff about myself that I don't necessarily have the language for, but I'm getting the message that it's not a thing that's welcome here. It's actually a thing that is actively being told is wrong or something's wrong with people like that. And so I started to drift away from it. And by the time I was 15 or 16, I kind of like formally was just like, I don't believe in this anymore. I don't want to be in this space anymore. And I left that. By that point, and I tell people that my first understanding of gay was Matthew Shepard, the murder of Matthew Shepard, because it became a national story. And it was something that, even being sort of in a more remote space, a more rural space, like it was on the news. It was a thing that like Matthew Shepard's murder and then the conversation that spawned made its way into everything. Mm-hmm. And so, that was where I kind of started to get like the language and the vocabulary to kind of understand or think about that. That's also, then you saw things like shortly after that was like Will and Grace on TV and stuff like that. So I started to develop the language, a basic language of identity around who I was, but it was all couched in this thing of just like, oh, okay, this is something that'll get me killed. And where I lived was in the swamp, still is. It's, very conservative, kind of like active Klan area. So it was a thing where it's like, okay, like I got to keep this in. So I withdrew a lot in that space. And so I withdrew from everything. Like I was, I'm naturally introverted, but like I definitely leaned into it. Didn't really engage, like the faith space wasn't there for me or anything like that. And then when I went to college, like that's where I eventually came out and spent a number of years exploring that. And I kind of reached a point where I realized that like there were little things like throughout my 20s that I realized that like faith or spirituality or something like that was the thing I kept feeling myself being pulled back towards. Like even when I was in high school and I left like the church, it was also around the time like The Craft came out. So I was like, okay, let me like go on this like religious walkabout. Like I read about Buddhism. I read about like, I was trying to, there was looking back, there was always this part of me that was like, okay, I left this space, I left this institution, but what it means for me, the comfort it provides me to have some sort of spiritual outlet or something to kind of tap into that sort of like immanence of the divine, whatever that might mean. It's something that's very deeply personal, deeply important to me. And I think it took about a decade from leaving the church. So I reached a point where I had a major sort of like health episode. I developed a MRSA infection that went systemic, almost died. And kind of on the other end of that, it just started popping up where I was like, there were these aspects of religiosity that were calling to me, but I still had a lot of trauma around sort of like the institution and Catholicism, and was very hesitant towards it. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I kind of re-engaged with like, I guess, paganism. There wasn't a particular path that I kind of followed. And for a long time, they were separate. Like everything about myself as a gay man was separate from everything I did in sort of a pagan space, because I still had that religious trauma around. So anything that was spiritual or faithful or anything like that, I had to keep it away from queer stuff. And that just wasn't sustainable for me. And I would say the story of my 30s, so I turned 40 a week and a half ago at the time of this recording. The story of my 30s was spending a lot of time deconstructing and reconstructing and integrating what it means for me to be a spiritual person and a gay person, and how those two things are not at odds with each other. They actually inform each other and they feed each other. And approaching it from like an academic lens, I am sort of like professionally an academic. So kind of understanding and reading about other cultures, other ways of being, other ways of valuing, other ways of building community, other ways of knowledge making. But then because I found myself more and more drawn into spaces where through my advocacy, through activism, I was kind of put into these roles of maybe like leadership roles or whatever they might be, then feeling like, okay, well, I have a responsibility to make sure I'm not going to fuck this up. Then, I went to Cherry Hill Seminary, which is a pagan seminary. I took their program in community ministry. And then eventually I became ordained with Sacred Well Congregation. And that was never the intention. And so, but it was through every new thing that unfolded. I was like, well, I feel obligated to make sure I'm doing things in a way that I'm not going to screw this up. And one thing led to another. And then I ended up becoming a priest anyways, just in a totally different way that I had initially intended to be.
Yeah. It's like your two worlds collided into one.
Absolutely.
And it's such a beautiful thing that you were able to incorporate those into each other, from previously thinking that I couldn't to then realizing, no, I can weave these into each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, and part of it too was that I'm involved in a lot of advocacy and activism, and a lot of that, in my 20s was that academic approach, where it was like, wow, I was exposed to communities or struggles or things that I didn't know a lot about, and then educating myself on it. And then again, my 30s being it's not that it wasn't the fact that I learned about these injustices that made me want to do something about them, realizing that my drive for social justice is also a very spiritually motivated, spiritually driven drive. And I learned about, this concept or this idea or philosophy of spiritual activism, and then realizing like, oh, like that speaks to me. And so like, I really credit glomming onto that and realizing that like I feel called to do social justice work, because for me I feel it's a spiritual calling, as like the through line that like everything else got swept up in that wake, and that's what kind of brought all the disparate parts of like my worlds, my identities together. Like it's all due to realizing that being like the motivating force in my life.
Yeah. Can you just describe what spiritual activism, what that means to you?
Yeah, so I'm the way that I understand it, the way that I've come to my sort of relationship with it is through the work of a Chicana feminist author, Gloria Anzaldúa. So I highly recommend folks take a look at her work, especially her collection of essays throughout the course of her life, called, the English version of it is called Light in the Darkness. If you don't know Spanish, have like a English to Spanish, Spanish to English dictionary, because the way that she writes, even in the middle of sentences, she's weaving it in and out of Spanish. But for me, spiritual activism is, so she has this idea, this Nahuatl concept called Nepantla, which is this idea of like the in-between space between different ways of being, different things. She grew up on the border, so she talks a lot about borderlands, the idea of sort of like having these identities that kind of don't fit into any space. Nepantla is that space, that frictive space between two different ideas or ways of being or static things, where when they come into contact with each other, that is the space where new possibilities are born. And there are people who actively step into that space and navigate that space either voluntarily or involuntarily because of their identities. And she talks a lot about this, about as a queer person, as a disabled person, as a Chicana. There's some aspects of her identity where she stepped voluntarily into these spaces, and there are some aspects of her identity where she had no choice but to be in those spaces. And those people she refers to as nepantleros or nepantleras, and they're the people who can help folks see beyond these static forces and imagine other worlds, other ways of being. So for me, that informs what I think of as spiritual activism, where my spirituality is the driving force behind not only why I want to eradicate injustice or dismantle systems of oppression, but it is also the generative force behind what helps me to envision other possibilities. It's not just about like, this is what calls me to confront injustice. It's also about, this is what informs what I think justice looks like and what I think sort of a better world could be.
Yeah. Okay. I like that a lot. I feel like a lot of us, when it comes to activism, we do it just because we are pulled to do it. But I like that deeper meaning behind the spirituality of it too. Like,
and I think especially in the States, like the queer liberation movement and stuff like that, like if you look at these liberation movements, they are very open, especially the early sort of founders of it. They're very open that they look towards the Black civil rights movement, the Black liberation movement for this is how we do the work. And if you look at that, like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, like all these folks, they were also operating out of a place that was religiously or faith held space. That was what got them through being able to believe that there was a better future ahead, even if it wasn't something that they were going to see, that they were still, there was a better future that they were going to be able to make for like their children and grandchildren. So, I mean, now for me, it's hard to look at activism or advocacy as divorced from spirituality.
It's hard to think about when we come to like social justice and activism, the immediate future, like, because sometimes it's a process too. We need to fight now, not just for our future selves, but future generations, because it's the right thing to do. We want what's right in the world, whatever that looks like. Just being human, like being allowed to be human beings is like what I want for our future selves, for us and future generations, just to be treated like human beings. And it sounds so simple, right? But yet it's not happening. That's something that's a driving force for me. That's what I want for us. One question, when you say the swamp, what do you mean?
I mean, like the Everglades, like the swamp.
Everglades. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to be clear there. And that's where you're at now. Correct.
No, so I'm in the Mid-Atlantic. I live just outside of Baltimore.
Okay.
But my family is still down in South Florida in the swamp.
Yeah.
I love the Everglades. Like I love swamps. So like swamps to me, like there are some in the Mid-Atlantic, there are some marshy parts of Maryland and stuff like that. And I love going to New Orleans and seeing like the bayous and stuff like that. Like that is in my blood. I love it. They are gorgeous to me. I know a lot of people look at them and just like, there's nothing here, but they're just such active environments and biomes, and they're just, to me, incredible.
Yeah.
So I say it with a lot of reverence for the environment, but also like I do kind of like in one breath, I'm also saying like the swamp in kind of like a dismissive or derogatory way where I'm like that kind of hellhole, but I'm not talking about the environment in that way.
That's fair. I got you.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense. Let's move forward to queer ancestors. I know you talk a lot about this. I'm really curious. Can you talk a little bit about connecting with queer ancestors, what that looks like, and the significance of it?
Absolutely. So queer ancestors, whether it's queer ancestor veneration or what have you, is a central part of my own personal spiritual practice, but also a central part of kind of like the ministry work that I do. And I think it weaves together a lot of kind of what we've already talked about. You talked about that having to imagine that like a better world is possible where you can just be human, even if we may not be the ones to see it, what have you. I think for a lot of folks that can be, I've been in a lot of spaces where the fact that folks are fighting for change that they may not see is very disheartening for them. And so having that conversation around like, planting seeds for the trees whose shade you may never sit under, right? And then being able to look back at sort of like ancestors of the movement or ancestors of community and saying like, well, these were folks who were fighting for stuff when they never had any guarantee that they were going to benefit from it. Many of them never benefited from it. They set the foundation for things that we now benefit from.
Yeah.
And so, this idea of being able to look back and see, this is what we're talking about. Like we benefited from this. And so it's possible, because a lot of folks are just like, well, I don't even know that it's going to happen. It's like, well, in some ways, yeah, kind of have to have faith or have hope that it's going to happen. But part of it is that for me, when I talk about being in community, I don't think that you can be in community without being in community with your dead. And especially if we're talking about sort of queer ancestors or the LGBTQ plus community, there's such a monumental effort, especially now. We kind of see it resurface now with sort of like the MAGA movement and Christian nationalism and all this sort of stuff, to erase queer history, to erase queer identity.
Yep.
Part of it is because part of what creates a community is having a shared story, or enough of an overlap with histories that you kind of have like a shared identity. So if they erase our histories and our stories, it's hard for us to feel like we in the moment belong to something larger. So it leaves us feeling isolated. It leaves us feeling vulnerable. It leaves us feeling scared. Mm-hmm. So part of queer ancestor veneration is just is looking for them and telling their stories. So, I have a blog that I run that I try to do. It used to be monthly. Now it's kind of semi-monthly just because there's so many other things happening, but I'll do like queer ancestor spotlights. And I tie that to, I use ArcGIS to do sort of like a world map where each pin is associated with a different queer ancestor spotlight post. So that way you can read about queer ancestors. And it's just like an overview of an event or a person. I'll do some of the heavy hitters, right? Like I'll do like James Baldwin or Frank Kameny or Audre Lorde or something. But I also try to find like folks whose stories are not as well known, or locations that may not be as well known. And I try to make it's a work in progress, but my goal is to make it as international as possible. So that way you can kind of see these things. I always put links to like, to if you want to dive deeper, like here's links to go read more. So I'm not writing like a huge essay. It's a couple of paragraphs. So you get a general kind of sense of their story, and here's where you can read more. But you can also go to the Queer Ancestor map and just kind of see visually kind of we're spread all over the place. We're everywhere. So it's kind of, part of it is being in community with our dead allows us to be in community with our history and our stories. But they're also then figures that we can go to for support, or for guidance, or for strength, or just for sometimes just to not feel alone. So I talked about Matthew Shepard being sort of like my first awareness of what that's what triggered all of the conversations that were happening around me, that gave me the vocabulary around gayness. But we read when I was in high school, so this was maybe a couple of years after Matthew Shepard, we read The Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde was the first historic queer figure I ever heard about or learned about. There were historic figures I had learned about before Oscar Wilde that come to find out were queer or likely queer or what have you, but that was never information that was shared. But my English teacher at the time, in that lesson, we talked about Oscar Wilde, we talked about his trial, we talked about all this sort of stuff. And so he was the first figure that I was ever presented with who was a historical figure, who was queer, that then I remember being in 10th or 11th grade, I don't remember what, and having that moment of just being like, oh, wait a minute. So like, we've been around. Like, there's somebody from 100 years ago who was queer. So then part of, I think that was sort of the nascent beginning of sort of my queer ancestor journey.
Yeah.
Part of it is then understanding our history helps us to also combat the narratives that they try to use against us now and kind of pigeonhole us in. Yeah. Especially when it comes to sort of how folks talk about trans folks right now, that understanding that what gender means, also with sexuality, but also like what gender means, how gender is performed, how gender is constructed, has differed across time and culture, and even right now across different cultures, there's different conceptions of gender, and multiple cultures right now have multiple gender categories, have third gender categories that are just culturally accepted in their communities, or beyond that. Having, doing that work of kind of uplifting queer ancestry, I think helps to push back against some of like the just the toxic miasma that is just kind of out there right now.
That is ongoing, and it's funny. I mean, it's not funny, but when you talk about other cultures that are totally familiar with different genders and identities, and it's being on a spectrum and stuff, and here we are in America where they're trying to say, nope, it's one or the other. I mean, it's so weird to say, right? We're in America. We're supposed to be like leading the way for other countries, and we're not.
Yeah.
And it's so sad. It's so sad because, I mean, for so many reasons. When you talk about like your first experience with queerness or being exposed. So I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and you didn't talk about it. Nobody was out. You didn't come out. My first time, I think I may have heard of Matthew Shepard at the time, because I'm going to be 40 in January. So we're kind of in that same age frame. I remember hearing about it, but it definitely wasn't into my queerness at the time. I didn't know I was gay. I was homophobic, right? Because that's just what you did. Middle school and early high school and stuff. It was the story of Brandon in Boys Don't Cry. That is like the first story that I really like leaned into and was curious about, because it was horrific. It was absolutely tragic. I mean, it's very similar to Matthew Shepard, right? In that they were murdered for being queer, part of the queer community. That was my first kind of exposure to it and dialogue. But you just had that memory pop up for me, like my first early story of the vocabulary surrounding the queer community and at that time, trans community. But I remember watching it going, this doesn't seem like being trans. Like, that wasn't the part of the story that affected me. It was how tragic it was on how they were treated and then murdered. I mean, yeah, and right now them trying to get rid of our queer history, that totally makes sense. The way that you put it is they're trying to kind of destroy our community from history on. Right? They're going back as far as they can to get rid of that so that we feel less connected as a community.
Well, and it also disempowers you.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have, because then it makes you feel like you are building everything from scratch, and it makes everything seem monumental. It's just like, but if you understand that, no, I am just continuing a legacy, or I'm continuing this work, then it like to understand that you have the momentum of history and hundreds of people behind you.
Yeah.
Is and I'm talking from like a lived experience space, because like when I started going to like marches and stuff like that, I can't do that so much anymore just because of I mentioned being disabled. So about 8-ish years ago, I had a I don't want to say developed a chronic illness, because it was there the whole time, just like asleep, and then it woke up. So I can't. It's a little bit harder for me to do that sort of work, which is why I kind of started to pivot more into this sort of stuff. Because like, well, this is something I can do, because this is just as important, just as relevant. But you know, the first few marches and stuff I would go to, like, I was terrified. And I'm a big dude, so like, I don't know how much is coming across on the screen or whatever, but like, I'm 6'3", I'm like 280. You know, I'm built like I used to play football. I didn't play football. I was not an athletic person. But like, you know, I'm a big dude, and I have often in many situations just leaned into how like imposing I look physically to kind of navigate certain spaces. Or, you know, like, I am not somebody who's really ever felt afraid walking home at night, you know? But I was terrified of being in these like marches, especially with these queer spaces and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I started doing more queer ancestor work, and actually part of my own personal practice is I have a queer ancestor shrine that I built in my backyard. And so this was the previous house that my husband and I lived at. It was like a little row home situation. We had like a patchwork sort of back, like a little postage stamp backyard. So it was a smaller thing, but that's where I started the shrine practice. And we were going to the counter protest for like the second Unite the Right rally that was going to be in DC. So it was one that was like 2 years after Charlottesville. And I remember being a little bit nervous because I was like, I don't know what's going to happen. This was under the Trump administration. This was in DC. This was, you know, anything could go off. And I remember before we left, like I went to the queer ancestor shrine in my backyard. I lit some incense, and I just kind of had a moment where I just kind of like named being afraid, but also named that I knew that, especially at that point, I had started this queer ancestor spotlight sort of process, and then being able to name that, it was like, I know so many of you were also afraid too. Like I've read your own words. I've listened to your interviews. So I know that you too were afraid and you still did this. And knowing that is helping me step into this space and understand that I'm just continuing the work that you were doing. And when I tell you that when I was in that march, and there was like a literally physically embodied feeling of just kind of feeling like they were also behind me, made it entirely different. Like I ended up, like I went there with the intention of like, I'll just be in the crowd. And I ended up like my husband and I were like at the front of one of the contingents holding like a giant pride flag or something. So like having access to that sort of well of strength physically feels different. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah. No, that's incredibly powerful, especially like thinking about protests and stuff now. It is terrifying because the opposition is so empowered. Like you just don't know what they're capable of. So, but knowing that we're not the first generation to walk down the streets and fight for our rights or whatever it may be, fight for just humanity in general. This isn't the first time. And I've had to be reminded of that at one point because it feels like it's new, right? Because for a while I feel like we were doing okay, and now we're going backwards in our administration and our rights and everything. So it feels like we're fighting like this is a new fight, but it's not. We have had many decades of fighting, and this happens every so often. As you were sharing your story of going to that protest and having the ancestor like talking to them and speaking that way, it reminded me of Emphas' book, the queer rights passage in there that is directly related to kind of that connection with your ancestry and going through the passage of having that strength to go to a protest, and which is fantastic. I know you know Emphas' book, and they were wonderful to have on here.
I wrote a ritual for their book about a chosen family hearth ritual. And then in that book, I recently co-edited with Laura Tempest Zakroff, the third in the New Aradia volume, third volume of the New Aradia series. Enfys then contributed to that book as well. So we're showing up in each other's stuff all the time. Yeah. So.
I love that so much. So spirituality is something that I've just recently kind of tapped into in the last couple of years. And I'm always curious to hear about other people's stories and experiences because I think we all tap into it very differently, and it looks very differently for all of us. And it shows up at different times in our life for different reasons. Yeah, it always gives me something to think about when people talk about their spirituality and how they connect. And right now, I think connecting with our ancestors, especially in the queer community, it just feels like we need more of that. And I love that you're contributing to that environment into the community as far as talking about ancestors, and whether you're blogging or on your website. And I'm so excited to get that out to the listeners. I'm going to put that on my website because I feel like that is a whole other side of activism that we should be tapping into. Just like the education part of it can be super powerful and enlightening.
Well, and so there's also the like 5 different things try to come out of my mouth at the same time.
Do it. No, you're good.
So, one of the things that I tell folks is, well, I want to start with this story actually. One of the things that I do annually, and this started in 2020, and it started totally by accident, but then it became this annual thing that I post. And I wrote up a ritual for it, and I have like a growing playlist on Spotify, but it's a queer ancestor dance party. And it's this idea of being in celebration, like dancing and that sort of stuff, and inviting, if you are like me and you believe that, spirits exist, things like that, inviting the spirits of those queer ancestors to kind of be in a celebratory dance space with you, for those who love to dance, for those who maybe never got the chance to dance, for those who couldn't express themselves that way at the time, just being in this sort of community that kind of spans across sort of states of being and time through dance and music and celebration. Or if you don't believe in spirits, then just honoring the fact that you're here alive now, able to dance to this music in this space with your community because of people who could and for people who couldn't. And I had posted, this was maybe 2 years ago, whatever it was, that So that time of year, I usually posted like last week of May going into Pride Month. And I posted it on Facebook and I forgot to lock it down, and it broke containment and went into the awful side of Facebook. And I wasn't paying attention because I didn't have notifications on it until somebody texted me and they're like, hey, you might want to look at like that post because like it went sideways. And I went on there and I cleaned it up. I locked it down. I changed who could post, who could comment. But one of the comments that always stood out to me is some person who was just like, and I'm paraphrasing it because I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but it was just like, queer people don't have ancestors. And instead of being like mad or upset or whatever, I was just very sad, but not for me. Like I was just very sad for that person, because clearly what that person was trying to say is this very sort of like biological essentialism sort of approach to it. It's just like queer people don't have ancestors because queer people don't breed and make more queer people. And I was like, well, first off, if you're thinking about just blood ancestry, I did not spring up from the earth fully formed. Like, so I do have family, but also queer people can have kids. But also it's such a limiting view of what ancestry and community can be. And to me, that's deeply, deeply sad. And I think it's deeply indicative of a lot of sort of like the harm and trauma and anger we see in the world right now, is these very limiting views of what community should be or can be, is that it's very narrowly defined. So I think that celebrating queer ancestors or understanding queer ancestry is also a celebration and understanding of a more expansive view of what community can be. So I think there's that. The other thing too is as far as sort of reclaiming that sort of spiritual space too, is I talk a lot with some folks. I was for World Pride in DC. World Pride was in DC this past year, and I was involved with the World Pride Interfaith Service, but I was also on a panel about it was called Pride and Pluralism. It was put on by the National LGBTQ Task Force, and it was about sort of interfaith approaches to advocacy, so like queer advocacy. And one of the things that kind of came through, and I've talked in a number of spaces with people, is this idea of, folks are surprised that like I'm an LGBTQ plus activist advocate, but I do it in a spiritual way and blah, blah, blah. But at the World Pride Service, there were so many people. The local like small town pride that happens where I'm at is on, I think, a Lutheran church, like grounds and stuff like that. So what I tell people is that queer people did not leave religion. Religion left queer people.
Yeah.
There are so many folks that I know who are queer or trans who, in whatever way speaks to them, are deeply spiritual or deeply religious people. So this notion that, and I think that was part of my issue kind of like in my teens and 20s and stuff like that, was I kind of bought into this sort of stereotype that to accept being gay meant you have to leave certain things behind.
Right.
So I think, part of my work is kind of undoing that, but also educating folks that it's just like, no, like we just because we accept and celebrate who we are doesn't mean that we are then leaving these things. We may be leaving that space, but it's because that space has decided it wants to abandon us because of who we are. And then I think right now, so I live in, like I said, I'm outside of Baltimore. I live in Maryland. Unfortunately, Maryland it was from Maryland that case that the Supreme Court recently ruled on that kind of allows for like now the national opt-out for LGBTQ plus curriculum in K through 12 schools. We know what that's going to look like. We know what that's going to mean.
Yep. I
think interfaith spaces and faith spaces, I do a lot of work with local UU congregations. I have a friend of mine in Michigan who does a lot of work with United Church of Christ. A really good friend of mine is in a progressive synagogue in Baltimore that does a lot of work with like Jewish Voices for Peace as regards sort of like everything going on in Gaza. And I think right now, in theory, we still have religious freedom. I think, there's still carve outs or spaces for folks to kind of say like, well, we're going to do stuff in these spaces because it is our deeply held religious or spiritual belief that this is good, that this is righteous, this is what we should be doing. So I also think that is ground that historically the queer community, trans community has not leveraged or tapped into, for reasons that I totally understand and don't want to invalidate. But I think there is so much space there that we can preserve a lot of what's being lost in certain other secular or public spaces, preserve them in those spaces in ways that can make sure people still have access to them. But then when we're on the other side of this, and there will be on the other side of this, that we don't have to rebuild from scratch. Then we've preserved what we can preserve, and then we bring it back.
That's beautiful in a sense of it's hopeful. There's so much, there really is hope for the queer community and everything that's happening right now. We just can't lose sight of it. You know, we have to keep doing things like this, like speaking up for the queer community, sharing your story, which I so much appreciate you doing, because there's so much power in that in itself, making people feel less alone in their journey, especially within the queer community right now. There's so many people out there right now that are just feeling hopeless and lost and alone. I appreciate what you're doing, because it's people like you that are really that driving force. So thank you. The message that you're sending to people, just all of the things, I can't express it enough, honestly. Can you please share with everybody where they can follow you, books, reach out to you, all the things?
Yeah, so the best place is my website, so whiterosewitching.com, that you can sign up for a newsletter through there. You can also find I'm pretty active on Instagram. I used to be more active on Threads and Blue Sky, but about a month ago, I made the decision to take it off my phone because it was just a deeply unhealthy relationship.
Fair enough.
So I use them on desktop, so like I engage with them still, but just not as much. But Instagram I kept just because I've curated in such a way that it's actually a uplifting space for me. And by that I mean that a lot of the content I follow is just dogs and drag queens. So
there you go.
yeah.
Perfect. What else do you need, honestly?
Yeah, dogs, drag queens, and some of my favorite bands. And I'm like, this is so my website, I also have a Patreon that I started at the beginning of the year, and any support, there's multiple tiers from like $1 to $20. But if folks want to support the work that I'm doing, every little bit helps. It helps me to pay for things like my Zoom subscription, or like just basic sort of stuff that I need so I can kind of continue to do sort of workshops or webinar series or in-person events, so that way I can afford to like rent spaces if I need to. Or my mom was like an artist. She still is. She like loves to make crafts and do things. She used to like sell at local craft fairs and stuff. So I also am an arts and craftsy sort of person. So like I love to do like queer ancestor talisman workshops. And so I bring like people joke that I come in like the arts teacher in elementary school that didn't have a room. She just had a cart. Yeah. So I love to like create, to do workshops or space or things where people can create, like physically make something. Unfortunately, that requires money to buy things. So, but if you like queer ancestors or spirit, want to learn more about spiritual activism, things like that, a Patreon exclusive is access to, I do divination via bone casting. So that is something I offer exclusively through Patreon as sort of like a thank you for supporting me in that way. I mentioned briefly Serpents of Circe. It is the third volume in the new Aradia series that was started by Laura Tempest Sackroff. Serpents of Circe came out last year. And it's the full title is Serpents of Circe, A Manual to Magical Resilience. And it's a collection of essays, rituals, spells, what have you, for building resilient, approaching resistance work through building resilience and building community. The first two series were a little bit more aggressive, sort of like, hey, we're going to actually like do some combative stuff. And this is about how do we rest and how do we build community. This is actually pretty interesting because I just got the green light to actually like talk about it now. But I was also recently contracted by Llewellyn, a pagan publishing company, and to write a book about queer ancestors. So I will be working on that. If you want more information as it becomes available, either follow me on Instagram, sign up for my newsletter,
yes,
or follow me on Patreon. We'll get first updates. But yeah, I'm very, very nervous, but very excited about that opportunity to put something together that I hope will be of use to.
Yeah, that's amazing. Congratulations on that, by the way. That's awesome. Yes, please follow Reverend Ron on all those places. I will also put them in the notes, of course, so you'll have easy access to those links to follow him. If there was one little nugget of advice that you could share with the queer community, what would that be?
I think one of the things that is very empowering and liberating and reframing about queer ancestor veneration, working with queer ancestors, is how it makes you become aware that one day you too will be a queer ancestor. And so being much more aware of what is the, not what is the legacy you want to leave behind, because I don't want to talk from a place of ego, but our job is just to push the boundary. So how far can we push it so that way when we pass the torch to the next person, it's easier for them. So queer ancestor veneration is not just a backwards looking practice, it's also a forward looking practice that really makes you on sort of the impact you're leaving.
Yeah. I love that. That's actually been resonating with me a lot lately, especially with the passing of Andrea Gibson recently in the last few days, the impact that they have made on the community. Like, we can only hope to leave that impact, have that same, not same, but see, I want to use the word legacy, but you know what I'm saying. Be remembered as such a powerful individual within the queer community, just leaving that mark. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, sharing your story, what you're doing. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, please leave comments for Reverend Ron and myself about this episode. You can also follow Queer in Here on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Queer in Here Podcast. You are loved. You are enough. Please lean on each other and ask for help when needed. And remember, queer joy is resistance. See you next time.